Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on the architecture of institutional legitimacy in American democracy. We're drawing on material covering elections, courts, legislative structures, really the rules of the game.
Right.
And the core question that seems to emerge from all this analysis is pretty fundamental, isn't it?
It is. Does institutional legitimacy primarily depend on enforcing, clear, uniform security standards and limiting political overreach? Or is it more fundamentally rooted in maximizing equal access for all citizens and ensuring fair, proportional representation? I'll be arguing for that first perspective, that legitimacy flows from clear rules, secure processes, and importantly, structural constraint on central power. And I'll be taking the other side. I think the material suggests legitimacy really requires equal, convenient access to the ballot, combined with strong guardrails to prevent minority rule, basically ensuring our representative bodies actually reflect the electorate and can respond effectively.
Okay, so my position really centers on process stability and the trust that comes from observable security. The case for prioritizing clear rules, as laid out in the material, basically posits that uniform standards are essential. They're the preventative measure against chaos, potential fraud, and institutional overreach. Practically speaking, this points towards prioritizing pretty stringent election integrity measures, things like requirements for voter ID, diligent maintenance of accurate voter rolls, strict chain of custody standards for every single ballot, and maybe a necessary skepticism towards mass, unsolicited mail ballots or broad ballot collection schemes. Why? Because those mechanisms can introduce a kind of systemic opacity. Trust isn't just, a given. It has to be built on visible consistency and verifiability. And institutionally, this focus on constraint, it extends to the courts. It supports ideas like judicial restraint and textualism, the notion that courts interpret law, they don't legislate from the bench. We see things like the major questions doctrine emerging as a potentially vital check on policy overreach by unelected agencies. And furthermore, we'd argue for process stability in Congress, keeping rules like the filibuster, precisely because they demand broader consensus. They act as a necessary brake against these wild, unpredictable policy swings that can really undermine long-term confidence.
That's an interesting frame, focusing on stability through constraint. But, I'd frame legitimacy quite differently. I mean, if the rules of the game structurally exclude eligible voters, or if they let partisan actors engineer extreme entrenchment, then the resulting outcomes fundamentally lack true democratic legitimacy. It doesn't matter how securely those flawed processes are run. So our priority is voting access. This means embracing things like automatic and same-day registration, providing ample early and mail voting options, ensuring secure, accessible drop boxes, and critically, restoring voting rights after incarceration. These convenient methods, we see them not just as preferences, but really as a civil right that directly boosts participation and frankly reflects modern electoral needs.
Okay.
And on representation, the material strongly advocates for independent redistricting commissions, whether nonpartisan or bipartisan, guided by clear criteria. The goal is to curb extreme gerrymanders that allow minority factions to wield disproportionate power. And finally, institutions have to show they can respond through modernization. This likely requires establishing federal baseline standards for both access and security, ensuring professional local funding for elections, and reforming things like the filibuster. Maybe with carve-outs, maybe transforming it into a genuine talking filibuster so that broadly supported legislation can actually pass. And in our view, the courts have to play a robust role here, enforcing equal protection and actively upholding democratic norms against systematic suppression.
I see the emphasis on removing friction, viewing access as the primary metric. However, the material also clearly illustrates something else. Without robust, standardized security measures, like requiring voter ID and implementing comprehensive chain of custody protocols for ballots, a significant portion of the electorate just views the process as inherently suspicious. Now, this perception, whether you think it's accurate or not, it dramatically reduces cross-party acceptance of results. And that's a key metric the material cites for institutional stability. So if trust requires visible security, then standardizing and enforcing these integrity measures, providing clear expectations and verifiable processes, that seems non-negotiable for maintaining public faith. The case for security isn't just about stopping actual fraud. It's also strong when it focuses on preventing the appearance of chaos and uncertainty.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the friction introduced by some of those measures is merely minor or somehow acceptable collateral damage. Critics argue, and frankly the data suggests, that rules like rigid ID requirements, especially without easy, free access to those IDs or severe limitations on early and mail voting, they can become significant barriers. They demonstrably reduce turnout at the margins, and often particularly among specific demographic groups. The goal has to be security without suppression, right? And the material outlines ways to achieve this technologically. For instance, expansive mail voting can be perfectly secure if it's paired with modern mandatory controls. I'm talking about comprehensive paper trails and, crucially, risk-limiting audits, RLAs.
Okay, RLAs.
Yeah, RLAs are a powerful tool. They let election officials statistically confirm outcomes by checking just a sample of ballots, providing a really high degree of confidence and transparency without needlessly hindering access for everyone. Look, when integrity rules feel like they're designed to reduce turnout, they actually become a vulnerability for those prioritizing security precisely because they're perceived, rightly or wrongly, as targeted suppression.
That's a compelling point about using technology like RLAs to enhance transparency. I grant you that. But the core issue, I think, remains that when you expand mechanisms like mass unsolicited mail or, very lax Dropbox collection rules, you exponentially raise the sheer volume of material that has to be tracked. It complicates the chain of custody. It increases opportunities for potential abuse, even if you use statistical sampling after the fact. Consistency and timely results, which the integrity focus provides, those are critical metrics for public trust before certification happens. This seems like a fundamental tension. One side prioritizes the ease of the process, the other prioritizes the verifiable clarity of the outcome.
But is the tension entirely inherent? I think it's often about design, as we sort of touched on. The material itself offers a potential bridge concept here, doesn't it? Pairing security measures like universally applied voter ID, but with proactive solutions like mandatory provision of free IDs for anyone who needs one. Couple that with robust, expanded early voting opportunities. That design choice could address the security need for uniformity while simultaneously eliminating the access burden of cost or inconvenience. If we can move past using integrity just as a justification for suppression and instead use it as a framework for professional, accessible administration, maybe we can meet both goals.
I agree that such a hybrid approach holds some promise, definitely worth exploring. But let's shift focus a bit to structural constraints. If legitimacy, in my view, is partly defined by constraint, we have to examine how those constraints function within legislative bodies. Specifically, the Senate filibuster. Does the material suggest this rule is a necessary safeguard, or is it actually an active impediment to legitimate governance?
While the filibuster, certainly in its current form, it enables pretty extreme gridlock. It allows a minority to exercise what amounts to a constant veto over broadly supported legislation. The material clearly suggests that when a legislature is functionally incapable of passing these widely supported reforms, especially when a clear majority of voters supports action on key issues, it risks losing its legitimacy as a responsive body. The data points to decreased public faith in the capacity of the federal government as a result. So weakening these veto points, maybe through reforms like instituting a real talking filibuster or carefully defining carve-outs for specific policy areas like voting rights, that could dramatically improve institutional accountability and responsiveness.
I see the desire for that kind of legislative responsiveness. I do. But retaining the filibuster or something like it ensures that congressional rules promote stability. It requires a supermajority consensus before fundamental, potentially really polarizing policy shifts occur. This constraint isn't just an inconvenience. It's arguably a necessary brake on central power. It mandates cross-party buy-in for major directional changes. These structures that require broader consensus, they prevent the kind of policy whiplash that the material itself warns can severely damage long-term institutional stability. If the definition of legitimacy includes structural resilience, then preserving something like the filibuster might be paramount. I'm genuinely not convinced by the argument that says we should just abandon structural constraints simply because they're currently inconvenient to whoever holds a slim majority. Curb these veto points in now, and they might just backfire spectacularly when political control inevitably flips, accelerating the very cycle of instability and whiplash you say you want to avoid.
So you're prioritizing the prevention of policy whiplash over the ability to pass broadly supported reforms. But isn't stability in a system that allows an entrenched minority to dictate the national agenda indefinitely just through procedural rules? Isn't that functionally anti-democratic? The structural difference seems stark. We believe an institution gains legitimacy by acting effectively in response to the public will. Your position seems to prioritize preserving the rule itself, even if that preservation leads to legislative failure and growing public cynicism. And if we look at the materials analysis of, say, gerrymandering, it shows how entrenched minorities in state legislatures just exacerbate this problem. It proves that procedural constraint doesn't automatically mean balanced governments. Often, it just means institutional ossification.
Okay, well, shifting to federalism then, this same principle of constraint, I think, must apply to the division of power between federal and state governments. I emphatically support the federalism first principle in areas like elections. States must retain the primary role in running elections and managing inherently local affairs like schools and policing. The material shows that a fear of nationalization eroding state diversity and the capacity for policy experimentation, that's a core driver for supporters of institutional constraint. Imposing broad, top-down, national floors for election rules risks creating a bureaucratic, one-size-fits-all mandate. It disregards crucial local needs and removes the flexibility that might be necessary for effective administration in very diverse jurisdictions. Legitimacy here comes from ensuring power is appropriately distributed, not overly centralized in Washington.
That reliance on federalism, though, it feels a bit based on a romantic idea of local control that maybe doesn't match the current reality. The reality is that these local administration fights over funding, over rules, over outcomes, they are already being intensely nationalized. This leads constantly to destabilizing lawfare, forum shopping, which is precisely what fuels polarization and erodes confidence across the board. We're not arguing for a complete federal takeover here, but for a professional federal floor for access and security standards. That means national baseline requirements for professional local funding, maybe mandatory use of paper ballots everywhere, and the widespread adoption of those risk-limiting audits we discussed to ensure administrative capacity. Without some kind of floor, we see systemic suppression and administrative failures cropping up repeatedly.
The material highlights that the conflict between the two narratives, access versus security, it's already a nationalized political fight. Retreating to a theoretical federalism just leaves local administrators fighting highly polarized battles with adequate resources or clear ground rules.
But who defines that floor? And where does the mandate creep end? That's the potential vulnerability of the centralization argument, isn't it? Nationalizing standards inherently risks overly bureaucratic mandates that could stifle STOT-level innovation and responsiveness. While I certainly agree that standardized recount triggers and clear certification safeguards are necessary to prevent chaotic post-election disputes, the fundamental principle of states running their own elections, well, that preserves administrative diversity and local accountability, which is itself a core component of the legitimacy framework for many, many citizens. We have to resist the temptation, I think, to solve every complex problem with a top-down federal mandate.
But we're seeking clarity and standardization where fundamental rights are clearly concerned. Take gerrymandering reform, for example. While states should manage their elections day to day, the material really shows that only a clear, perhaps federally encouraged or mandated set of anti-gerrymander criteria, focusing on measurable things like compactness, equal population, protecting genuine communities of interest, can truly curb the worst excesses of partisan map-making that undermine representation. A federal floor doesn't have to remove all state control. It can establish the necessary professional boundaries to guarantee the system actually delivers fair representation, which is fundamental to its legitimacy.
Looking across our discussion then, my strongest argument, I think, remains that institutional legitimacy fundamentally requires clarity, uniformity, and constraint. These elements provide the stability that's necessary to minimize the risk of fraud, perceived or actual. They help manage public expectations, and they curb political overreach by limiting the power of any single faction or branch. Trust ultimately comes from a process that is visibly, rigorously secure, even if that security sometimes requires diligence from the voter and requires restraint from those in power.
And I'd reiterate that, from my perspective, the key to legitimacy is inclusion and fair representation. This demands robust access rules that make voting convenient, not an obstacle course. It requires courts to actively enforce democracy norms and protect fundamental rights against suppression. And it necessitates institutional modernization designed specifically to prevent minority rule through structural entrenchment or procedural loopholes. An institution that can't respond to broadly supported public needs, or one that actively limits the franchise, well, it sacrifices its legitimacy, even if it claims to be doing so in the name of stability.
Ultimately, I think the source material reveals we're grappling with two deeply competing narratives of legitimacy, aren't we? One audience sees lax rules, late results, complexity. They see that as suspicious, as potential evidence of fraud.
Right. And the other audience sees rigid security hurdles, voter roll purges, procedural limitations like the filibuster. They see those as systematic suppression, as barriers to fair participation. This inherent tension definitely heightens division.
It does.
Precisely. So maybe the real value for the listener is in analyzing the specific practical bridging ideas, trying to move beyond just the rhetorical divide. We need to look seriously at design solutions, like that combination of independent maps with real transparency and clear criteria, or establishing rigorous certification safeguards that have very limited, clearly defined grounds for refusal, ensuring trust without granting unlimited veto power to potentially partisan officials.
And so we leave the listener to weigh these structural arguments. Whether a primary focus on security and constraint offers the most reliable path to institutional trust, or whether maximizing access and enforcing proportional representation must ultimately define the bounds of institutional legitimacy as we move forward.